Everyone, hello and welcome back. Before tonight's introduction, do we have an announcement from Ruth, or yeah? Do you want to come up the side of the stairs, Ruth, or do you just want to, actually I can hand you a,
Hi, some of you are very familiar with who I am and what my cause is right now. And some of you ask why I'm on the Cather board, since I'm obviously not a Cather scholar and I don't live in Red Cloud. So my name is Ruth Keene, and I am on the board. And as I have explained to a few of you, my whole point is to raise money for the Willa Cather Foundation and to increase the membership. So here we go. And I've done this before. Okay, now, if any of you would like a hotel room and you have $100,000, you've seen these brochures. You've seen these brochures about the Hotel Garber. You've looked at what the progress is, but in case any of you are questioning how can I get involved, for a mere $100,000, you can have a room with your name on it. Okay. And if you don't, if you're thinking, well, just not quite that much, but we still need some money to raise for the wallpaper restoration project in the Cather home, which I hope most of you have been up at sitting up on top. We're really working on it and so on. We've raised a lot of money, but we need another $200,000 to finish the wallpaper project at the Cather home. Okay, just wanted you. But most important thing, you see these green ribbons? I need to see some more of them. And I have some here. I have some. So for $50, you could have a green ribbon attached to your name tag, and every one of us should have one. Or you can pay $125 or $250 or $500. We've got all kinds of rates. But I want to see some more of those. So I have membership. And so I'm just going to walk around, and I would love it. And if any of you do it instantly, I'll give you your green ribbon right now. But we've gotten so tech happy. I don't know how to do it, but I am told you can go on your phone and you can join. And what do you get? You get your wonderful, that literary magazine. You get notices about what's happening, and you get more appeals to give money. So anyway, I'm gonna come down and I'm gonna just walk by. But if anybody wants their green ribbon right now, I have the brochure, or you can go online, or tomorrow we have the green ribbon. That's it. Thank you.
We didn't script that. But thank you, Ruth, and thank you to all the members who are here this evening and the ones who may be considering joining. We appreciate it so much. We are so pleased tonight to welcome Shelley Stamp for an invited lecture as part of our 68th annual Willa Cather Spring Conference. And before we do, I want to note again that this event wouldn't be possible without the support and the generosity of many friends whose financial assistance helps to underwrite this conference. So I do want to take a moment and recognize those who are with us tonight. And I would like to just run through these names, and then if we could ask the sponsors to stand and be recognized, I would appreciate it. So Jay Yost and Wade Leak, Melissa Homestead and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Cather Project, Anna McCracken, Sydney Green and William Lord, Glenda Pierce and Jeff Kirkpatrick, Marian Arneson, Dan Deffenbaugh, Tom Gallagher, Mark and Linda Robeson, James Japp, Jennifer Beam, Ruth Keene, Larry and Lynn Fenwick, Sharon Cohout, Daryl Palmer, Will and Joan Dunphy, Ann Forsyth, Becky Faber, Chuck and Nancy Peak, Bob and Debbie Thacker, and Kay Staley. Wow, it's a big list. Thank you. I also want to offer our sincere thanks to Humanities Nebraska for their support of tonight's program, which made the event freely accessible to all. Humanities Nebraska is a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching personal and public life by offering opportunities to thoughtfully engage with history and culture. And they receive additional funding from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. Erica Hamilton is our longtime program officer with Humanities Nebraska, and we so appreciate their partnership every year. Thank you, Erica. All right, so why a lecture about filmmakers in early Hollywood at a Willa Cather conference? Cather and her publisher sold the movie rights for A Lost Lady to Warner Brothers in 1923, and it was released as a silent film in 1924. By the late 1920s, Warner Brothers sought the sound rights to A Lost Lady, and while Cather had her reservations about having her name attached to a dialogue that was written by someone she didn't know, imagine that, she ultimately agreed, and she sold those rights as well. Money talks, I suppose. So if you plan to visit the Mark Dolly Art Gallery tomorrow to watch the 1934 film with Barbara Stanwyck, I think you'll get a sense of why Cather wasn't pleased with the outcome of that decision. And that's all I'll say, because Shelley Stamp has so much more to share with us this evening. Dr. Stamp is the UC Santa Cruz Presidential Chair and the author of Movie Struck Girls, Women, and Motion Picture Culture After the Nickelodeon. Oh, I'm sorry, which was a finalist for the Theater Library Association Book Award, and the author of Lois Weber in Early Hollywood, winner of the Michael Nelson Prize from the International Association for Media and History, and the Richard Wall Special Jury Prize from the Theater Library Association. Her research has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and a University of California President's Fellowship. Dr. Stamp's talk will position Cather's writing and career within the wider context of women's work in the early American film industry, as well as consider the production and reception of A Lost Lady within the context of female authors, screenwriters, and directors working in early Hollywood. Her lecture this evening is titled Willa Cather and Company: Female Filmmakers, Female Screenwriters, and Female Authors in Early Hollywood. So without further ado, please give a warm Willa Cather Spring Conference welcome to Dr. Shelley Stamp.
Good evening. Let me see if I can get this presentation going here. I was having trouble earlier, but okay. Um, so I'm really honored by the invitation to speak here tonight. I have to begin by confessing that I'm not a Willa Cather scholar. In fact, I've already learned a great deal about Cather and her work at this conference. I hope to learn a lot more. What I'd like to do tonight is provide a little context for the adaptation of Cather's work in early Hollywood, and in particular, the first screen adaptation of her novel, A Lost Lady. So it's often said that Willa Cather was antithetical to having her novels adapted for the screen, that she didn't trust Hollywood with her work. Indeed, writing to Ferris Greenslet, her editor at Houghton Mifflin, prior to the release of the second Lost Lady in 1934, Cather expressed dismay about this earlier 1924 adaptation. The earlier film version, she said, didn't result in any marked increase in book sales, and the letters she had received from moviegoers at the time suggested they were messy and illiterate people. She agreed to sell the screen rights to The Song of the Lark in 1932 only after getting Houghton Mifflin to promise that they would never ask her to sell the rights to My Antonia. After that, she refused all subsequent requests for radio and phonographic renditions of her work, claiming these performances turned her writing into sentimental nonsense. And then Cather's will ultimately contained a prohibition on any further adaptation of her work in films, stage productions, radio broadcasts, and any future media that might be invented in the years to come. Her friend Alfred Knopf claimed that Cather used to say to me that if she wanted to write a play or a motion picture, she would have written a play or motion picture script. So this history is likely very familiar to most of you in this room, right? But I want to suggest that the landscape of Hollywood in the 1910s and early 1920s, when the first adaptation of A Lost Lady was produced, was a landscape that might have interested a leading female author like Cather, that she might have been quite genuinely intrigued by the collaborative possibilities of a screen adaptation of A Lost Lady, given how much female talent dominated early filmmaking behind the scenes in Hollywood. So Warner Brothers acquired the rights to A Lost Lady in early 1924, when the novel was already in its 7th printing and just prior to its syndication. The print syndication would, according to one movie trade publication, provide an excellent advertising and publicity medium, keeping the novel fresh in the minds of many readers and preparing them for the screen version. Cather, of course, had won the Pulitzer Prize the previous year for one of ours, and she had recently been named one of the 5 greatest American authors, the only woman amongst that august group. So Warner's was investing not only in the novel's popularity, but also in Cather's wider renown. There was considerable excitement in the film industry trade press about having the work of such a revered author adapted for the screen. As LA Times critic Edwin Shallert put it, there was rather high anticipations of the screen unfoldment of A Lost Lady. I don't think unfoldment is a word, but Shallert kind of conveys the excitement, right? Warner's, for its part, leaned heavily on Cather's literary reputation to enhance their own pedigree. Cather's name was prominent in all publicity materials that I've seen for the 1924 film, with one advertisement noting that it was based on Cather's tremendously popular novel. Warner's included A Lost Lady among a slate of releases for the 1924-1925 season that emphasized important literary adaptations, calling them classics of the screen made from big books and plays. As one movie trade paper put it, Warner's had spared no expense in going after the biggest literary and dramatic plums on the market. And as an example of this, along with A Lost Lady, Warner's also acquired the rights to Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence, winner, of course, of the 1921 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. Wharton and Cather were, the exhibitor's Herald pointed out, 2 of the foremost women writers in America. So this is Warner's slate. This is how they're positioning A Lost Lady. Warner's assigned screenwriter Dorothy Farnham to adapt Cather's novel. Farnham had penned the studio's very successful 1924 adaptation of Beau Brummel, starring John Barrymore. Barrymore had been so pleased with her script that he proclaimed his part the greatest role written for him up to that point in his career. As the Los Angeles Times put it, with Beau Brummel, Farnham had proved her ability to inscribe the dramatically appealing on the silent canvas. After A Lost Lady, Farnham would go on to write several scripts for Greta Garbo in the late 1920s, helping to define the actress's American screen persona, a testament to the respect in which Farnham's work was held. Farnham said at the time, she thought very carefully, I think, about screenwriting. She said, writing a scenario is an orchestration in a way, because you must proceed from one emotion to another rhythmically. A successful scenario sings its own lilt. You have to feel the course of your theme tremendously and always consult your heart before your head. So Farnham, established, well-respected screenwriter attached to A Lost Lady. But Farnham was part of an extraordinary generation of female screenwriters in early Hollywood. In the 1910s and early 20s, all of the top screenwriters were women. Let me say that again. All of the top screenwriters were women. We are so far from that situation now, 100 years later, that it's almost impossible for us to imagine a world in which women dominate screenwriting and thus American movie screens. We can't imagine it, but it was a reality. In no other field of early filmmaking were women as powerful as they were in screenwriting. This generation of female screenwriters wrote and thus defined the key screen personalities of the era. June Mathis, top screenwriter of the 1920s, appointed head of the scenario department at Metro in 1918 when she was 27 years old, was instrumental in writing scripts that shaped Rudolph Valentino's persona across multiple films and thus completely redefined masculine norms after World War I. So incredibly influential in American culture if we think about the way Mathis shaped Valentino's persona. Frances Marion was largely responsible for crafting Mary Pickford's persona, both on screen and off screen. So she wrote multiple scripts for Pickford at a key point in her career. She also ghost wrote Pickford's syndicated newspaper column called Daily Talks with Mary Pickford. So Marion, again, incredibly influential in shaping probably the top screen persona of the silent era. Anita Loos helped to define Douglas Fairbanks' brand of kind of upbeat athleticism. If you know his films from the 1910s, he's kind of a wacky, upbeat athleticism. Jeannie McPherson wrote virtually all of Cecil B. DeMille's best-known early work, including groundbreaking sex comedies and career-defining roles for a very young Gloria Swanson. The creative collaboration that McPherson and DeMille had lasted for nearly 2 decades. Right? They were very tight couple and co-creators. Right? She was a founding member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. So this is just highlights of this generation of female screenwriters in early Hollywood in the 1910s and early 20s, and a sense of how influential they were. And screenwriters during this era wielded a lot of influence at every stage of film production. We tend to think of screenwriters as kind of writing alone in a room and handing the script off and never being involved in filmmaking. During the silent era in particular, they were very involved in multiple stages. So in pre-production, screenwriters would be involved with set construction and wardrobe and props. They would be on set often, consulting with the director, consulting sometimes with actors during shooting. And then in post-production, they might be involved in editing. They might be involved in writing the intertitles for the silent films with dialogue and expository information. So screenwriters were very involved in film production, right? And screenwriting in these early days was understood as a profession especially suited to women. So not only were all the top screenwriters women, there was an understanding that this was a profession that was suited to women. So women's magazines like Woman's Home Companion ran pieces advising their readership about scenario writing as a potential career. Movie fan magazines ran articles on screenwriting as a new profession for women. And these articles in both women's magazines and fan magazines claimed that women were naturals as film writers because they wrote letters and diaries and regarded paper as a confidant of their dreams and fantasies, right? So therefore they were particularly adept at screenwriting. And these columns also claimed that screenwriting was a kind of profession, a kind of work that suited women because it could be completed almost anywhere, right? Including at home. It could be tucked in around other routines, including domestic responsibilities. And it didn't threaten conventional conceptions of femininity, right? So it was a kind of profession that was being advertised to women, right? There were these incredibly prominent famous women in Hollywood, but it was being advertised to women in women's magazines and fan magazines. There were correspondence schools for potential screenwriters that targeted women in particular and promoted famed female graduates. Most of the early screenwriting manuals were authored by women. These are just two examples: How to Write for Moving Pictures by Marguerite Birch, and then our friend Anita Luz also co-wrote a volume called How to Write Photoplays. Dorothy Farnham, adapter of A Lost Lady, did not write an entire manual herself, but offered advice for home scenario writers in 1928, saying above all, be visual, in your conception, right? So screenwriting is a profession in which women excel in early Hollywood, and a host of other women in the early movie industry worked alongside screenwriters at all levels of studio writing departments, right? So each studio would have a writing department that would be staffed by clerks, by manuscript readers, by story editors, by title writers. The vast majority of those employees were also women in the 1910s and early 20s, so much so that the story departments were described by one observer as a manless Eden in 1920, right? So this is a profession that's really dominated by women. Also important to remember that during this time, audiences were predominantly female. It's really difficult to track this kind of demographic accurately, but one 1927 estimate suggested that 83% of movie audiences that year were female. And one female screenwriter exhorting studio executives to cater to this majority said, "Remember the 83%." Again, this is maybe something we could take a lesson from 100 years ago. So Willa Cather, I think, must have been aware of this generation of female screenwriters. And I think one bit of evidence that we have for this is that when it came to adapt A Lost Lady for a second time in 1934, Cather asked that screenwriter Zoe Akins be assigned to the project. That didn't come to pass. It'd be wonderful to think about what would have happened if she had. But you can see why Cather might have wanted Akins to work on the project. Akins had been a protege of Cather early in her Akins had been a protege of Cather early in her career, and Cather had helped Akins publish her first collection of verse. And by the early 30s, when A Lost Lady was being adapted for the second time, Akins had become a very successful screenwriter. She had written 3 screenplays for director Dorothy Arzner, a lesbian and a strong feminist voice in 1930s Hollywood. So Sarah and Son, about a mother who is separated from her son, was billed at the time as an all-femme film because it was directed by a woman, it was written by a woman, it was edited by a woman, and it had a female production assistant. So it was promoted as an all-femme film. Working Girls, another one of Akins' scripts, is about 2 sisters who arrive in New York City looking for work. It deals with both the sort of homosocial bonds of a women's boarding house, but also the the difficult heterosocial terrain of a workplace. It deals with, really frankly, with sexual harassment, with sexual double standard. One of the sisters becomes pregnant as a result of an affair with a married man. And then Christopher Strong, probably Aiken's best known work, collaboration with Arzner, features Katharine Hepburn in her sort of breakout role. She plays an aviator who becomes pregnant as a result of an extramarital affair. Spoiler alert, commits suicide by plane in the film's harrowing final scene. These are amazing films, really, really amazing films. So these are all made before the second screen adaptation of A Lost Lady. These are made when Cather is asking that Aikens be assigned to adapt the second version of A Lost Lady. So I know that Cather, we know she's aware of Aikens. I think she must have been aware of this incredible generation of female screenwriters. So screenwriters were an incredibly vital, influential community in early Hollywood in the 1910s and 20s when Cather's work was first adapted. Female filmmakers, female directors, were also extremely prominent during these years as well. 100 years ago, the movie business was a place of incredible opportunity for female directors, arguably much more open to women directors than it remains today. Early movie making was a flexible enterprise where it was relatively easy to move between creative positions. The role of the director, as we think of it now, wasn't as clearly defined. So people who entered the business in one capacity could move to another role. So women came to directing through screenwriting, women came to directing through acting, and so there were many routes to directing, and there were many female filmmakers. And the indication for this is that of how visible women directors were in early Hollywood is that a 1920 volume called Careers for Women included a chapter on the motion picture director, pronouncing that women will find no finer calling than the filmmaking profession. This is 1920. A book on careers for women is singling out the motion picture director as a potential career option for young women. And this early generation of female filmmakers really advocated strongly for the importance of female voices behind the scenes of this phenomenally popular new medium of the movies. So Alice Guy Blaché, one of the most prominent female filmmakers of the early years, the first filmmaker, published a piece called Woman's Place in Photoplay Production in 1914, where she made the argument. This was not an argument where she said, I think you should let us make a few movies. She said, women are better suited to directing than men. And here was her argument. She said, women possess an emotional intelligence that is key to directing performers. Women have an attention to visual detail that's key to a visual storytelling medium like the cinema. And the intimacy of movies with their close-ups was particularly matched to female directors, right? This is an argument that, on the one hand, is maybe laced with gender stereotypes, but on the other hand, I think it's a pretty profound and radical argument, right? Women are better suited to being, and this is an argument that's made in 1914. It wasn't made yesterday, it was made in 1914. And the other thing that female filmmakers did at this time is that they reminded us that women bring a different perspective to cinema. So Lois Weber, who I'll have more to say about in a minute, said, I like to direct because I believe a woman more or less intuitively brings out many of the emotions that are rarely expressed on the screen. I may miss what some of the men get, but I will get over effects that they never thought of. Translation, I see things men don't. It's a very simple and profound statement, right? That still resonates today, right? I see things men don't. So female filmmakers during these years produced an enormous range of work across varied genres, including westerns, comedies, action-adventure films, melodramas, social issue films. They made shorts, they made features, they made commercial films, they made amateur films, they made fiction films, they made nonfiction, just across the gamut. And women empowered with creative authority behind the scenes imagined new women on screen as well, right? Again, a very simple point, but it's worth saying, right? Women working behind the scenes imagine new images and versions of femininity on screen. And so we tend to think of female movie heroines from the silent period as damsels in distress, right? Victimized and vulnerable child women tied to the railroad tracks awaiting a male savior. That's what we think of, right? Nothing could be further from the truth. So action-adventure serial star Helen Holmes wrote and directed many episodes of her serial, The Hazards of Helen, telling an interviewer, if I want really thrilly action, I ask permission to write it myself. Because she said male writers usually won't provide for a girl things to do that they wouldn't do themselves. And if you have an opportunity to see The Hazards of Helen, the stunts are amazing. Leaping from speeding motorcycles onto moving trains, leaping from trestle bridges onto moving trains. Incredible stunts of physical daring done by female action adventure heroines. So written and directed by Helen Holmes. Another cliche of silent cinema, we tend to think of slapstick comedy, we think of Charlie Chaplin, we think of Buster Keaton, we think of Harold Lloyd. We think it's an entirely male domain, but Mabel Normand was directing comedies at Keystone long before her contemporaries Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. In fact, Normand directed Chaplin in some of his earliest screen appearances as the Tramp. There, you can see him here in Mabel at the Wheel, which she directed. And Keystone head Max Sennett later claimed that Chaplin learned to direct from Normand, right? And her film's also amazing. She's a really keen observer of gender norms, and her comic shorts have play in really interesting ways with masculine and feminine codes. Alina Zimova made highly stylized and eroticized productions, including an adaptation of Oscar Wilde's Salome, collaborating with designer and choreographer Natasha Rambova, also her lover. Zimova emulated European art films. She kind of looked beyond Hollywood, incorporating elements from contemporary avant-garde theater and dance. And Salome has a kind of unmistakable homoerotic aesthetic. It's a really interesting experimental film from 1922. So there's women working in Hollywood studios, and there's women working outside the studios as well, kind of carving their own terrain. One example of this would be Marian Wong, who founded the Mandarin Film Company in Oakland, California. Wong wrote, directed, and acted in The Curse of Kwang Guang in 1916, the first feature made with an all-Asian American cast at an all-Asian American company that offers a really important counterpoint to racist depictions of Asian characters in other films of this period, right? It's her only known production. Accounts at the time suggested she formed the production company and had every intention of making a whole body of films. It's the only one we know of, the only one that's, luckily it survives. Angela Murray Gibson ran Gibson Studios in the small community of Castleton, North Dakota. She's a kind of amateur small-town filmmaker, really interesting. She worked together with her sister, who managed the business, and a contemporary report observed, it's a long way from the bright lights and stucco bungalows of Hollywood to the unpretentious simplicity of this little town in the rolling Dakota wheat fields. But Gibson, she appears in the films herself, she casts community members, she wrote, she directed, she acts, she operates the camera when she wasn't in front of the camera. She edited her films, so she's a kind of amazingly ambitious amateur filmmaker who didn't feel the need to go to Hollywood, right? She worked out of Castleton. Another incredible example of what's being done not just outside of Hollywood, but outside of Hollywood models of filmmaking are the ethnographic films that Zora Neale Hurston made in the 1920s, documenting Black communities in the rural South. Her films provide an amazing view of Black communities in Central and Southern Florida in particular, in the late 20s when nobody was documenting these communities. And she has extraordinary footage of these communities where you can see her engagement with the communities. There's people that acknowledge the camera and smile at the camera because it's Hurston. You can see some of this. Sometimes she's filming dances and celebrations, and the camera is moving because she's dancing as well. They're really extraordinary. Nell Shipman wrote and directed action-adventure films in remote northern Idaho and Canada. And in one of the films, the film you see here, Back to God's Country, her character drives a dog sled team across the frozen tundra for several days in order to save her male sweetheart. So these action-adventure heroines from the early days are really amazing, right? We have debates that are still going on right now about, whether big action films can have female action heroes, and the debate was settled 100 years ago, folks. Let's move on. And so I promised I'd come back to Lois Weber. I find it hard not to talk about Lois Weber. She is really, of all the women active in early Hollywood, Weber produced the most sustained and substantial body of work. She wrote, directed, and often acted in as well over 40 feature films, well over 100 shorts in a career that spanned 3 decades. She was the first woman admitted into the Motion Picture Directors Association in 1916. That's a precursor to what we have today, which is the Directors Guild of America. This is their earlier incarnation. They had to make an exception to policy to let her in because their association explicitly forbid female members, but they let her in. She was at several points the highest paid director in Hollywood. She was the top director at Universal in the 1910s. Carl Laemmle, who ran Universal during those days, called Weber my best man on the lot. But what's interesting about Weber and Universal is that she was not alone. There was a whole generation of women at Universal called the Universal Women. This is only 3 of them. There was probably 7 or 8 of them who were known as the Universal Women and directed films. Weber was the studio's top director, but then there was a whole bevy of other female filmmakers working at Universal in the 1910s. Universal released at least 170 films directed by women in a 5-year period in the 1910s. How many films did Universal release last year that were directed by women? 2. 170, 2. Right? So back to Weber, because again, I can't. So Weber is the top director at Universal. She is responsible for mentoring a lot of the other Universal women. Many of them acted for her, and then she helped them transition to become directors. In her time, Weber was considered one of the 3 great minds in early Hollywood, alongside D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille. Now, lots of you have probably heard of Griffith and DeMille, right? They're known as the fathers of American cinema. Weber's probably not as familiar to you, but she's one of the 3 great minds at the time. She is unquestionably considered their equal in the 1910s. And unlike Griffith and DeMille, Weber made popular films on some of the most controversial subjects of her day, right? She was really unafraid of controversy. So she made narrative features on capital punishment and police violence, on drug addiction, on poverty and women's wage equity, on religious hypocrisy. And she made 2 films on contraception and abortion in the 1910s. And she compared her films to living newspapers capable of dramatizing the most contentious issues of the day, and to sermons. That's the word she used, where she said, in films I can preach to my heart's content. And this to me tells us a lot, right? If she's combining sort of the mass circulation of a daily newspaper with the intimacy of a sermon, that to her is what cinema is. It has both the sort of intimacy and charge of a sermon delivered to a congregation with the mass reach of a daily paper. She also called cinema a voiceless language, not only because it did not have pre-recorded sound, but because cinema was capable of speaking to a broad spectrum of the country. She felt that uneducated or undereducated moviegoers who didn't read print media could grapple with these big issues through her films. She felt that recent immigrants who might not have a full fluency in English could also grapple with these issues in her films. So she was really ahead of her time, I think, in seeing cinema as a medium through which to grapple with really difficult issues, right? She adapted the work of many female authors, not Cather, alas, but Mary Roberts Reinhardt, Clara Louise Burnham, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She collaborated with many other female artists, many female screenwriters she collaborated with. She made a film, the only film, with dancer Anna Pavlova. Pavlova is arguably the most renowned female artist of their generation, and Weber directed Pavlova in her only screen appearance. And she mentored many, many younger women, as I've said, helping them move from acting into screenwriting or acting into directing. Right? So we can't know whether Cather would have been aware of someone like Weber or would have seen her films, but they're part of the same generation of creative, successful women. Weber was just 6 years younger than Cather. Weber left her hometown of Allegheny, Pennsylvania for New York City right around the same time that Cather left Pittsburgh for New York City. I would love to think that their paths crossed. I've never found any evidence, so I don't want to mislead you, but I think that they are of a similar generation, and you can see why I think, particularly with the first version of A Lost Lady, that Cather would have been intrigued by the possibilities of early Hollywood, with the screenwriters that are there and the filmmakers who are there, right? And then I just want to point outside Hollywood for a minute as well, because I think there's a whole nother piece of American movie culture where women were prominent as well that I think Cather may or may not have been aware of, right? So beyond filmmaking, female journalists and writers were also incredibly influential in shaping American movie culture in the 1910s and 20s. So daily newspapers, monthly magazines, movie fan magazines, film industry trade papers, all helped the country understand this brand new and incredibly popular medium of the movies. So the first journalist hired to write about the movies full-time was Grace Kingsley, hired by the LA Times. So the first journalist hired to write about movies for the first time is a woman. Syndicated columnist Gertrude Price was based in Hollywood. Her columns were syndicated all over the country. And as you can see from this image here, she really promoted women's work in the early movie industry. The rating system that we have for movies comes from the New York Daily News reviewer, Irene Thyrer. She's responsible for introducing the 4-star rating system in the 1920s, and we have some version of that now, right? Women wrote for movie trade papers. Over half of the writers for early fan magazines like Photoplay and Motion Picture were women. Many of the editors of these fan magazines were women. And they pioneered the kind of intimate tone of movie star profiles in fan culture that was initially geared almost exclusively to women, right? Intimate portraits of homes and closets and kitchens and bedrooms, right? Where the style of movie star profiles that are still with us, right? Female teachers, educators and activists understood the power of cinema. School teachers, most of whom were women during these years, saw cinema's educational potential. There was a huge movement in visual instruction in public schools during these years that was led by women. The superintendent of teacher instruction in California was particularly instrumental in this, right? Women were also key to promoting cinema screenings in non-theatrical settings, so showing films outside of movie theaters, showing films in churches, showing films in museums, showing films in community centers, showing films in prisons. Women were among the first to bring films into prisons. Public health nurses, again, largely women during these years, used films to document their work, to educate communities, particularly around issues related to women's health, so childbirth, infant care, pure food, right? Librarians, again, mostly women during these years, did all kinds of work to suggest book tie-ins, to host matinee screenings for children, to screen documentaries. Charlotte Perkins Gilman imagined the construction of free public film lending libraries across the nation, right? This was her idea, it didn't come to pass, right? So my point is this, outside of Hollywood, so we've got an incredible generation of screenwriters and directors working in Hollywood. Outside of Hollywood, women were also really instrumental in creating alternative, non-commercial ventures for screening films and in seeing films' educational potential. And then this goes even further because cinema's educational potential was not lost on more radical groups during this era. So many early feminist organizations produced films to garner support for their causes. They understood the persuasive authority of movies during these times, and they understood the importance of visual rhetoric in a feminist campaign. So two central feminist causes of this era both relied heavily on cinema: the campaign for women's suffrage and the fight to legalize contraception. So both major women's suffrage groups in the US made films to recruit viewers for their cause, and the leaders of these movements appeared in the films. So the British activist Emmeline Pankhurst, Harriet Stanton Blatch, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, and Jane Addams all appeared in American films to promote their cause. Blatch, Shaw, and Addams also made live appearances in movie theaters where their films were screened to galvanize audiences around the cause of women's suffrage. Same goes for the campaign to legalize contraception. Margaret Sanger, the leading advocate for legal contraception, wrote her film Birth Control while in prison. And the film reenacted scenes from her career, and then she too toured the country to speak during screenings of the film. Lois Weber, as I mentioned a minute ago, the era's leading female filmmaker, wrote and directed 2 narrative films on the campaign to legalize contraception. And in her second film, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, she herself played a birth control advocate imprisoned for activism, very clearly modeled on Sanger. Right? So this huge, big context, I think, helps us understand the first screen adaptation of Cather's work, the 1924 production of A Lost Lady, because it was women of Cather's generation who built American movie culture. As creators, working in the industry as screenwriters and directors, as critics, journalists, and thought leaders, helping to convey the cultural impact of this new medium, and as educators and activists who seized upon the opportunities that cinema afforded. So the novel's heroine, Marian Forrester, is a character who I think would have fit into the context of the unusual female characters on screen during these years, many written by women, many directed by women, right? As literary scholar Anna Kritik suggests, Mrs. Forrester is lost in the gender transitions from late 19th century womanhood to the new modern woman of the 1920s. She's lost in the class translation from the clear-cut divisions of railroad aristocracy and homesteaders on the one hand to the era of a messy new middle class on the other. And Mrs. Forrester is lost in translation herself because the novel is narrated from the perspective of her young male admirer, Neil Herbert. So Kritik says, Marian Forrester is never fully within our grasp. The novel's sly achievement is its author's ability both to offer and deny us her title character. Writing to her friend Alfred Knopf while at work on A Lost Lady, Cather said, "It's a little lawless, unmachine-made thing. Not very good construction, but the woman lives. That's all I want. I don't care about the framework. I'll make any kind of net that will get and hold her alive." So Cather knew how unusual Mrs. Forrester was. In a 1925 interview, Cather described her efforts to write the character again. She said the problem was to get her not like a standardized heroine in fiction, but as she really was, and not to care about anything else in the story but that one character. And so Cather knew how unusual she was. Irene Rich, who played Mrs. Forrester on screen, talked a lot about playing that character. So Rich said, "When I was assigned to the role, my friends stood in horror and awe. They said I should not play such a part, that the woman in the story received no sympathy at all, that she would be hated. But I hope not. I don't want her to receive sympathy. I just want those who see this picture to look in the heart of that screen woman and understand." Reviewers frequently singled out Rich's performance as Mrs. Forster, calling it superb work, one of the finest characterizations of the season. And Rich displayed a really nuanced understanding of the character in her interviews, refusing any suggestion that Mrs. Forster was wicked. This is Rich's word. Rich said, "I didn't play her that way. I want people to understand her. I liked the role very much because it was very, very real. Why, I know fully half a dozen women who are in exactly the same position." So despite Rich's evident investment in her character and Cather's original desire to create an unconventional female protagonist, some movie reviewers adopted an openly sexist disdain for Mrs. Forster's characterization in the film. So the New York Times' Mordaunt Hall, a very influential film critic at the time, called Mrs. Forster a dolt who does not know on which side her bread is buttered, declaring, "Toward the end, one loses all sympathy with her." Female movie reviewers tended to be more sympathetic to the characterization, with Matinee of the Chicago Tribune praising Rich's performance. So Matinee is a matinee, it's a pseudonym, but anyway. Tenay acknowledging how difficult such a characterization would be to portray, Tenay found that Rich nevertheless invested Mrs. Forster with a warm, compelling personality that never permits you to dislike her. Her reactions, if tragic and terrible, are nevertheless reactions that you understand. And this is what Cather wanted, this is what Rich wanted, right? So as I think most of you know, the 1924 print of A Lost Lady has never been found and is presumed lost. I say presumed lost since film prints are found every day, hanging around in people's attics and their cellars and their barns. So go home and have a look. Film historians like me never say never. But for the time being, we don't have the film print. So we are working with publicity materials and reviews and interviews, right? And a print of the 34 adaptation does survive. You can see it tomorrow if you haven't already seen it. Most agree that it's not an especially successful adaptation of the novel. Cather, as I recounted earlier, was by then extremely skeptical about Hollywood's adaptations of her work. I think it's important to recognize that the landscape of Hollywood had changed markedly by 1934 from the place it was in the 1910s and early 20s. An earlier generation of Hollywood had been filled with female screenwriters and directors who shaped novel depictions of women on screen. By 1934, there was only one woman directing in Hollywood. And the book, Careers for Women, that I mentioned earlier, whose 1920 edition had included a chapter on the motion picture director, eliminated that chapter in its 1934 reprint. So it's a different world by 1934, and we have been digging ourselves out of that hole ever since. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley, for a wonderfully insightful lecture this evening. And I think probably the first and most obvious thing I need to ask you is, what the hell happened? So why was the film industry so open to female screenwriters and directors in the early years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story. I've devoted a lot of my career to answering that question, but the short version is this, that in the 1910s, when film was first becoming incredibly popular, there was an incredible demand for movies. So movie theaters showed programs of shorts. They changed those programs at least several times a week, if not every day. So there was incredible demand for movies. And the industry was fairly artisanal at that point, and so it was pretty easy to get in to the industry, right? There was a tremendous demand. There wasn't powerful interests hadn't taken over. The industry hadn't coalesced in LA and Hollywood. So if you had some artistic ambition and a little bit of money, and it was relatively easy to get into the industry. And then, as I said, it was easier to move from acting to directing or screenwriting to directing, right? So that kind of and why not? You know, if you're a young woman in the 1910s and you want to do something interesting with your life, why not, you know, get involved in this new industry, right? So that's how it started, and then how it ends. It ends pretty rapidly in the early to mid 1920s. It becomes increasingly difficult for female directors and female-owned production companies to survive. So directors like Lois Weber and Nell Shipman and Alice Guy Blaché all have their own production companies, and they all collapse in the early 1920s. At that point, Hollywood has become an incredibly profitable industry. Studios whose names still dominate our industry landscape were consolidating control, right? They were buying up theater chains, they were shutting out independent production companies, and it became very difficult for independents to survive into the mid-20s. And they were, in order to buy up all the theater chains, they were borrowing money. And my fellow film historian Karen Ward-Mahar has the argument that in borrowing money from Wall Street, they also bought into a kind of Wall Street corporate culture, which was very male, and they weren't interested in female leadership or female directors. So that's the sort of short version of how it happened in the first place, and then how it ended so quickly, and why we're still digging ourselves out 100 plus years later.
Great, thank you for that. Well, let's talk a little bit about the source material. I wondered if you could comment a little bit on book-to-movie adaptations in Cather's day. Was literature commonly used as source material for film at the time, and perhaps more commonly than it is today?
Yes, I would say it kind of, there's different phases of it, let's say. In the early 20s, when the first A Lost Lady is adapted, you know, you saw that Warner Brothers is sort of promoting it as part of this slate of literary adaptations, and they're going after big authors like Cather and Wharton. Universal had a similar slate the year before, right, where they're talking about, you know, big, forget what, Universal had a very similar slogan, big pictures from big books or something. So that was definitely a trend in the early 1920s. But it was also common a decade earlier in the 1910s, when film is shifting from being a kind of quickly, cheaply made, tawdry entertainment into something that is more respectable. And one of the ways that filmmakers garner respectability for their work is to make literary adaptations, to make adaptations of famous plays or famous novels, and that is a way to sort of garner respectability. In the 1930s, literary adaptations kind of come back in the early years of the production code, which was Hollywood's self-censorship body. There was a lot of complaints about sex and violence in Hollywood in the 1920s, and the industry clamped down on itself in the early 30s and took a kind of conservative turn, and then turned to kind of literary classics in that conservative moment. And then in the 40s, it flips again, and the literary source material in the 40s is crime fiction, right? It's used for film noir in the 40s. So authors like Raymond Chandler and Dorothy Hughes and James M. Cain, are adapted to these kind of dark, violent noir. So it definitely goes in waves, and the adaptation of literature is used in maybe different moments. I think we're in a moment now of comic universe adaptations, which and the reason why the industry is attracted to the Marvel universe or to the work of a famous author is because they consider it a pre-sold property, right? It's something that's familiar to audiences. It's already demonstrated its commercial appeal, and Hollywood just wants to piggyback on that. It's a conservative response, in my opinion.
Well, we've already, of course, talked a little bit about the 1934 adaptation of Lost Lady, which was, you know, sort of, I don't want to say wildly unpopular, but not true to the text, certainly. And I noticed as we prepared for tonight's sit down that there was a male-female screenwriting duo that adapted that book for the 1934 adaptation. And I'm not going to blame it on the male, but I just wondered if you could speculate on what might have motivated that duo, the screenwriters, to take such a notable departure from what was a highly regarded book.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I can see what the studio was thinking, right? To me, it's a film that is attempting to piggyback on Stanwyck's earlier success of Babyface, which some of you might have seen, which is a 1932, extraordinary 1932 film, also directed by Alfred E. Green, the same director, and absolutely extraordinary performance. And I think the weird way that they adapted A Lost Lady is a way to try and get at that story. So Babyface is about a woman who leaves an impoverished industrial small town during the Depression and becomes very rich and powerful through her associations with various different men, right? And is a ruthless, absolutely ruthless woman who has been prostituted out by her father since she was a very young girl. So she turns that around into cynicism. So to me, that's kind of behind why they were doing what they were doing with The Lost Lady. But and so part of me understands why they move it into the Depression era rather than keeping it in its original time frame, because I think that there are aspects of the film that maybe speak to that, the economic collapse of the Depression, right? To me, the most glaring loss is the loss of Sweetwater. That to have it entirely set in an urban situation just misses the whole. So I'm not trying to make. I don't think it's a good film. I don't think it's a good adaptation of the book. But I understand the logic. Like, I really do think it was piggybacking on this earlier Stanwyck Green film and an earlier kind of cynical woman that Stanwyck played in Babyface.
Well, I think we have some folks passing question cards around for our audience. We'll have a couple more up here, but I want to encourage you to think about your questions for Shelley. And let's talk a little bit more about that 1934 adaptation, because your response to my last question makes me think in part that maybe the decision was also marketing driven, you know? And certainly the marketing campaign for the 34 film was much different from the 1924 version. I wonder if you could comment on why that was.
I mean, it's interesting to me because, you know, I said earlier that all the publicity I could see for the 24 version, Cather's very prominent, and all this sort of pre-publicity, like all those movie trade industry hype and the LA Times hype is about, you know, Cather this and Cather that, and Warner secured this great. And the 34 publicity, Cather's presence is not a huge factor. Her name is on some of the posters in a tiny font, but it's not a key. The adaptation of her work is not a key selling point of the film. The film is sold around Stanwyck. And it's sold around Stanwyck playing trying to think of the right word here, a difficult woman, right? And that's another hint that where I think that the marketing is piggybacking on the notoriety of Babyface as well, right? And placing Stanwyck. That extraordinary poster with Stanwyck's face kind of bisected, dark and light, is really extraordinary. So the earlier publicity is around the sort of, is really, Warner's is associating itself with Cather's renown in a way that the 34 version does not try to do, I don't think. The publicity for it, yeah.
Well, I was happy to hear that you're holding out hope that the reels for the 1924 film might still be out there. We had a lot of conversations about you know, how wonderful it would be to find that film and be able to show it here as part of this conference. But of course, we know it isn't uncommon for some of those early silent films to be lost. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit on that, and what are the challenges related to film preservation, rather.
Yeah, a huge challenge. I mean, most of the films made in the silent era don't survive. The industry was so forward-looking and so fast-paced that it didn't think about preserving its past, right? Sets were trashed or abandoned. Film reels were not kept once the film got out of its original circulation. That's why films are found. Films aren't found in the vaults of the studios in Hollywood. They're found literally in people's garages and barns and cellars. Like, that's where they are, because some traveling movie exhibitor kept reels of films, right? Or some theater owner kept reels of films, and then the grandkids have them sitting in their, so it's a huge challenge for film historians like me, because I've done a lot of work on Lois Weber, and most of her films don't survive, right? And so you're having to sort of piece together a film history from these other fragments. And she left no papers or memoir, right? So you're really constructing a history from very little. I am happy to say that in the past 10 years, there has been an extraordinary shift in the availability of early films. The films that do survive, made by women, written by women, have been preserved and released largely, many of them, most of them, on Blu-ray and DVD. Some of them are streaming on Netflix. So that the availability of what does survive has really changed in the last 10 years, and that's fantastic. But most of it's lost, and that's a reality. It's a hard reality.
So keep checking those barns and attics, folks. Well, my last question for you is about what you've read of Cather's text, and if there's a book of Cather's that you would most like to see adapted today for film.
Well, this is just it's just going to be embarrassing, but I'll have to admit. So the first thing, there's two embarrassing pieces of this. The first embarrassing thing is that I grew up in the Canadian prairies, and I did not read Cather. I can't believe that now. I mean, I can't believe. I read Lucy Maud Montgomery, because, her contemporary, because all Canadian girls read Lucy Maud Montgomery. But I was assigned F. Scott Fitzgerald in Hollywood. I was assigned The Great Gatsby, in high school, rather. I wasn't assigned Cather, so I didn't read her growing up. Right? This is the second embarrassing. My first introduction to Cather was in graduate school, so I'm a movie person. I saw the 1950s film Tarnished Angels with Dorothy Malone and Robert Stack and Rock Hudson. And it's an adaptation of a Faulkner novel about World War I flying aces who are kind of destitute and literally circling in air shows after the First World War. And in the movie version, I don't think it's in Faulkner's novel, correct me if I'm wrong. In the movie version, the wife of one of these airmen has kind of emotional connection to My Antonia. And it's the last book she read a long time ago. And in the very last scene of the film, if I'm remembering it correctly, Rock Hudson gives her another copy of the novel, and she goes off to Nebraska with her young son. So this is 30 plus years ago. Okay, I've got to read My Antonia because I like and I don't remember it that well, but I did. The movie prompted me to read My Antonia, I'm embarrassed to say, not my high school education. And then more recently, preparing for this, I read A Lost Lady, and I was, probably because I was thinking about these adaptations and I was thinking about A Lost Lady, the whole time as I was reading it, I was thinking, well, can you adapt this? I'm not sure you can, because of the way it's told. It's not about her, it's about how the men, what she represents to the men, what she represents to Mr. Forster and his generation, what she represents to Neil and the other. And that's a hard thing to do on film. I mean, that's one of the striking things about the 34 version is that she's the central character, and that's a little disorienting. Anyway, so I guess I would like to see someone try, but I think it would be really challenging to do A Lost Lady. I really do, to do it justice. And listening to the presentations today on the novel made me appreciate it even more, and the complexity of adapting it even more. So I think that's, yeah.
Well, I think this next question kind of allows us to continue that dialogue. It says, you mentioned, of course, the decline of Sweetwater is central to the novel. And the question asks, were screenwriters hemmed in by film technology and adapting A Lost Lady? Because depicting the town would be tough.
That's interesting because, I sort of think I have two minds about it. I mean, on the one hand, okay, I shouldn't even say this out loud. Okay, I'm going to say it. One of the reasons that the film industry coalesced in and around LA is because of the varied geography around LA, right? There's oceans and mountains and desert and forest, and there's nothing close to this landscape. I grew up in the Canadian version of this landscape, I know that. So, yes, to shoot on location in rural Nebraska in either the 20s or the 30s would have been an enormous undertaking that the studios wouldn't have done, right? So yes, that limitation is real, and but in the 30s to just put it in Chicago in the 1934 version is just such a bizarre reworking of it. Yeah. So to authentically film here, what the LA area does is have its geography stand in for geography all over the world, right? So they could have attempted something like that. I don't know. It probably wouldn't. Would have looked fake.
Well, this next question asks, with the shift to a male-dominated Hollywood, did the audience makeup also shift almost immediately?
No. You think it would? No. No. The audience stayed predominantly female through the 30s, through the 40s, particularly during the war years, right? There's 11 million men fighting overseas. And so particularly in the 40s, the audience is overwhelmingly female, and the industry understands that it's catering to an overwhelmingly female audience. So no, the industry becomes male-dominated, but the audience remains female. And the industry in the 30s starts putting out things that are actually called women's pictures, as if there's this sort of marginal group in the audience that they need to make a few films for. And so that's the thinking. Yeah, so there was a kind of disconnect, I think. The industry understood it was making films for women, certainly through the 40s, but there was no desire to staff the industry behind the scenes with women. There was still a fair number of female screenwriters in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, but the female directors really, there's one in the 30s, there's one in the 40s and 50s. They really dwindle.
This next question is going back to the period of time that women were dominating motion picture careers. It asks whether World War I had an influence on that phenomenon.
Not really. The Americans were in the war for such a short period of time. It didn't have an immediate effect in the 1910s during the war years, but in the post-war years, sort of 18, 19, 20, the industry is in a bit of a slump, and this is where the studios start to sort of consolidate power in 18, 19, 20. By 21, they've pretty much done that. So it's more the post-war period that has an effect than not so much the war years. In fact, there's kind of amazing serials. There's the action-adventure serials like Hazards of Helen that I was talking about. Some of those same serial actresses make wartime serials. They make sort of patriotic wartime serials that are kind of amazing with again, female action-adventure heroes in wartime.
I like this question a lot. Do you think Irene Rich or Barbara Stanwyck read the novel?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know. Reading what Rich had to say about the character makes me think that she might have, because she really did seem to understand it, and her friends clearly knew the character, right, of Mrs. Forster, and told her not, don't take that part. So it made me feel like maybe Rich would have. Stanwyck, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, or if she did. No, I don't think so. Not based on the. Yeah, the big disconnect between that character and Mrs. Forster on the page.
All right, well, let's talk about equitable pay. This question asks, was Lois Weber paid the same as Demille or Griffith?
Yes, she was the highest paid director in Hollywood. Several different times in her career. Yes, indeed. And Mary Pickford, so another example of pay equity. Mary Pickford, we think of Mary Pickford as the little girl with curls. Mary Pickford was incredibly powerful behind the scenes and really seized artistic control of her career very early on in the 1910s when she was still playing little girls on screen. She was very powerful behind the scenes and became a producer of her own films. And when she learned that Chaplin was earning more than she was, she said, I'm a bigger star than Chaplin. You got to pay me. And so she got up front and she got, what's the word? Residuals. So she was very savvy about that. So absolutely. So this has been a thing for a long time.
All right. I recognize the handwriting on this question, I think. I think I know who wrote it. In your opinion, what is the path forward for women filmmakers and screenwriters to gain the kind of status they had in the early 20th century?
Oh, if I knew the magic, if I had the magic bullet, that's the magic solution. People often ask me if I'm optimistic now, and I feel like, sort of. I feel like on the one hand, I've seen this before, right? We've 100 years ago, we've had this generation of women, and then there's a generation of women in the 70s during the women's liberation movement. Everybody's excited, yay! In the 80s and 90s, there's women, yay! And then everybody forgets, and then we're digging ourselves out of the same hole. So I'm a little afraid that we're in a cycle we're going to forget, but I do think things are happening now that are a little different. I think that. Women in Hollywood are really speaking out in a way they never have about pay equity. There have been some very high-profile cases where very well-known actresses on very well-known films have gone public, and their male co-stars, to be fair, have gone public about pay equity. That's really important. The Me Too movement in Hollywood has been incredibly important, and the actresses that have come forward with their experiences of sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual harassment is amazing. That gives me great hope. And I think what's also happening is that we have, adjacent to what's happening in Hollywood, there are scholars who are doing really important work. There is a group at the University of Southern California called the Inclusion Initiative, and there's another group at San Diego State University that are doing massive statistical analysis of Hollywood films, where they are literally counting the screen minutes that female characters speak, the the screen time that female characters have, the screen time that LGBTQ characters have, how many minutes they speak or not, characters with disabilities, characters of color, right? And that statistical evidence, which is shocking, how few minutes anyone other than white men speaks or is visible on screen in movies made now, that I think helps us. That's going to help shift the landscape, because I think without that statistical evidence, it's just sort of anecdotal and, oh, you feel this and you feel that, and we can say, well, no, actually, you know, this is the screen time. So that helps. And I think the other statistic they are proving is that films that are directed by women and or produced by women hire more women in positions of creative control. Duh. But again, we have the statistical evidence to prove that, right? So that, I think, that combined with how vocal women in the industry are being, and the, I think the entertainment landscape is shifting so much with streaming media that there are opportunities outside of the studios, which are becoming very, very conservative in this, under economic duress. They're just becoming more and more conservative, but there's lots of other opportunities. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. I feel like there is a path forward with this combination of things, if that makes sense.
We should be hopeful about the film being found and
right, exactly.
Yes, getting back to where we were in the 20th century. All right, last question, I think. Do we need to do a check of the room? I'll go ahead and pose this one. What is your favorite film made by a woman?
Oh gosh. Okay, I'm gonna just, because I'm gonna narrow it down to the silent era, because I don't think I could say. I think my favorite, again, well, I'm just gonna go with it. My gut, my favorite silent film made by a woman is a film by Lois Weber. You won't be surprised, I'm a big fan of hers, called Shoes, which is a very simple film about a young woman who works in a five and dime store. She works in Woolworths. We heard about Woolworths earlier today. Works in a five and dime store behind the counter to support her family. Her father is drunk and doesn't work. She's got 3 or 4 young sisters. She is not paid enough to support a family. Her mother takes in laundry. And it's an incredible, incredible portrait of urban poverty and a generation of female store clerks in the 1910s. It's made in 1916. It's really an amazing performance by Mary McLaren. It was kind of made her a star, the performance. So that might be my favorite. It's kind of an emotional favorite of mine. But, yeah.
That's great. Any more questions, Rachel? Okay. Oh, yes. So we need to, well, first and foremost, thank you, Shelley, for a very insightful talk. Really great to have you here to discuss such an intriguing topic at a time when we would love to see Cather adapted and reaching a wider audience. So thank you so much. Thanks again to Humanities Nebraska for their support of tonight's program. We really would appreciate it if you all, as audience members, would fill out your feedback forms, which helps us plan future events. And I would be remiss, too, if I didn't thank our board member, Peter Kipkowski, who through a series of connections led us to Shelley, and she wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't for that networking. And so thank you so much. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.